students, welcome back once again to another in our video lecture series in Humanities 231. I'm your instructor, Dr. Barry Graham. This will be Chapter 9, entitled Charlemagne and the Rise of Medieval Culture. We'll just get an overview of our map here of the Carolingian world, named, of course, after Charlemagne. As we're looking at this map, you'll see that this is a vast empire extended to modern-day France, Germany, the Low Countries, Italy, as far south as Calabria, and so a very extensive empire. Let's talk about Charlemagne. Charlemagne was, of course, a great ruler. He's also known as a great diplomat. In his papal coronation, he actually convinced Leo III, the Pope at that time, the leader of the Catholic Church, in Christmas in the year 800 AD, to crown him king of what would become the Holy Roman Empire. This is said to be a revival of the Western Roman Empire. So Charlemagne had great ambitions, as you can plainly see. What was in place at this point was what we call feudalism, or a feudal administration of some of the local independent rulers, and this helped to unite all of these lesser rulers underneath the king. The way that this occurred is that there were legal decrees whereby these rulers received land from the emperor, and they had permission to rule independently as long as they would swear allegiance to the king. And so the emperor would use these vassals as ambassadors, and this became an early form of the bureaucratic system. It obviously required something in the way of literacy, hence the growth of an educational system. They had to be able to read and to write in order to be able to sign these contracts, these legal decrees. And so an education or a degree of literacy, reading and writing, was really beneficial to all of them. And this led, of course, to foreign relations that Charlemagne was smart enough to establish in the Byzantine Empire towards the east, and even with the Muslims. Had it not been for his grandfather defeating the Muslims earlier in history, there would have been no revival of a Western Roman Empire. And as a matter of fact, of course, history probably would have been drastically different. The Muslims would probably have taken over the world had it not been for Charles Martel, Charlemagne's grandfather. But he was able to establish these diplomatic relationships. One of them, interestingly enough, was Harun al-Rashid, who was the Caliph of Baghdad. And if the name Baghdad rings a bell with you, you probably remember it from story 1001 Nights. If you saw the movie Aladdin, the Disney movie, perhaps when you were growing up, that there's a tie-in there with the idea of the Baghdad's and the 1001 Nights and the genies and the magic carpets and all of these kinds of things. Charlemagne was also key in terms of economic developments. He stabilized the currency. If you don't have a stable currency, something that people use nationwide or empire-wide, that can cause real problems, because how do you know what the exchange rate should be? And so having a stable currency that's recognized by everybody is very important. They called theirs the denier. It became the standard coin of the time. And this was big in establishing these trade fairs where people would come together and bring what they've manufactured and trade with each other, not only within the country but outside of the country. The Jewish merchants took on an increasingly important role in all of this. Charlemagne establishing all of these trade routes where in certain cities you would have to go through there in order to get to your next destination. The Jews tended to settle in these many places, and they became expert business individuals. And we see that to a certain extent carries over even until today. And so the import-export relationship was very important in terms of establishing ties between all of these countries within the, not only within the Western Roman Empire or the reestablished Western Roman Empire, but in these other countries as well. One of the things, as is today, that takes on increasing importance also is the idea of weapons. The United States today generates a great amount of money selling weapons to other countries. This was no less true during this time, and the invention of these iron broadswords that were used in so many armies was obviously very, very popular here, especially with the Arabs and the Vikings. Education and learning in the time of Charlemagne. This is interesting because we really see the birth of the modern day university. Charlemagne established what was called his palace school, right there in the palace where he reigned, there at Aachen. And Charlemagne himself, it's interesting to note, could not write. He was not literate himself. And so there was obviously a great need for education. If the king was illiterate, what do you think that meant for the rest of the population? And so he established and brought in many of these scholar teachers, and these were, of course, needed to establish education for the young. And there were few books available. The printing press had not been invented by this time. So what did you have to do? You had to master the text, and that basically means memorizing all or at least great portions of that textbook. Imagine today if you had to memorize the entire culture and values textbook that we use in this class. Well, that's what students were required to do back in the day. And that established a certain curriculum. They called it the trivium and the quadrium. The trivium was the learning of grammar, rhetoric, and the dialectic. And the quadrivium was arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And it's interesting that you note that if you add those up, it adds up to 7. That became the basis for the 7 liberal arts education or classical education. You'll notice that colleges and universities like Southwestern Christian College are called liberal arts colleges. That's a holdover from this particular period of history where this type of curriculum was originally established. So if you didn't know before, now you know. Another big motivation of this, and we mentioned the mastery of text and memorization of text, was that it created a need for text reform because these texts had to be brought up to date, just like textbooks today go through different editions and things of that nature. And one of the motivations for this was literary revival based upon liturgical revival. In order to be schooled in the study of Scripture and to learn the things necessary in theology, it was thought that this is another big motivation for us to learn how to read and to write because literacy was seen as a prerequisite for worship. How could you study the Bible if you couldn't read? And so you can see how that would provide a great motivation to do that. Continuing on here, one of these great scholar teachers was Alcuin of York. He helped to standardize certain church practices. Again, this education has a tie-in with what they're doing in church back in the day. He helped to learn the principles of correct writing and argumentation to better understand Scripture, not only learn it, but teach it as well. And so this affected, again, what you did in church. Sometimes those are in the Catholic Church, those are called the sacraments. So the sacramentary came into play. There was also a great need to correct the errors in the Vulgate Bible. If you're not familiar with that, if you research that historically, there was a great scholar, he's even considered a saint by the Catholic Church today, Jerome, who made the first translation of the Greek New Testament into the Latin language, which of course was the common language of the day and especially the language of the church. So they saw that just one translator was prone to make errors, and so that had to be cleaned up, so to speak. There was also a development in the Frankish school system. This tied in with the idea of scholasticism. Scholasticism, again, this idea that education is very, very necessary to better understand the Bible, because the church and the Bible is the center of this culture back at this period of history, talking about medieval times, obviously. It's interesting that when we look at the idea of being able to read and write and women, you would think that women would be, at this period in history, totally excluded from this. Well, they were to a great extent, but then again, so were men. Interestingly, there were women who were considered scholars and educated, but they only fell into two categories: the aristocracy, in other words, you had to be rich, or nuns, women who occupied some place of importance within the Catholic Church. And so Dehuda here actually wrote a book of Christian instruction for her son because she was able to read and to write. And these idea of illuminated manuscripts. Today we would call these illustrated books. This was a boon to learning because people sometimes tend to be visual learners. They learn more with pictures and words, more so than just words by themselves. And so introducing this concept in education obviously was of great importance. I mentioned the fact that she was a nun. This brings us into the idea of monastic life within Catholicism, within the Catholic Church. And so we have monks who are men, we have nuns who are women. This varied quite a bit. So in early monasticism, there were these varying monastic lifestyles, and there was no predominant rule to them. He brought a standardization to all of this, and this was called the Rule of Saint Benedict. His rules are considered the Magna Carta of monasticism. And so, again, what does it involve? This very ascetic lifestyle: poverty, stability, obedience, chastity. They went for a real balance of prayer, work, and study. Their motto was pray and work. And so it all revolved around this idea of the divine office. They called these responsibilities offices. And yes, that's where we get the term office today when somebody has a room where they do their study, because that actually began among the monks. Now, the orarium had to do with their daily schedule and some of the things that they did that reflected this monastic lifestyle. Now, it's interesting that the Apostle Paul actually rejected these things. The idea of forbidding people to marry and ordering them to abstain from certain foods. If you read 1 Timothy 4 through 5, Paul explicitly condemns these things. So this has been one of those very controversial things between Protestants and Catholics over the years, because obviously Protestants feel like these things that the Catholic Church requires monks and priests to practice is not in line with what the Bible teaches. So that makes for an interesting debate and discussion between Protestants and Catholics. Continuing on with the idea of women and monastic life, the nuns that we would call them today, it's interesting that with women in monastic life, this is one of the first things that are open to both men and women in history. There's no discrimination here. Women can engage in this just as much as men. And so we see individuals such as Scholastica, who was Saint Benedict's sister. She died about 543 AD. We don't know when she was born because they didn't keep good birth records back then. Likewise with Brigid of Ireland and Hilda, who was an abbess of Whitby. Hilda headed a prominent monastery of learning and actually hosted a synod back then, which was a gathering of many of the leaders. So women took on great importance in this. And then finally there was Hildegard of Bingen, She wrote medical treatises, music, literature, morality plays. She was a writer, painter, illustrator, musician, critic, preacher. Hey, look at this, way back in this time. These are some of her works that I won't bother to pronounce right now because they're in your textbook and you can look at those when convenient for you. We mentioned these illustrated books. There you can see it's written in Latin in calligraphy, a very advanced form of handwriting there. Again, there's no printing presses during this time. And you see the illustration there from Hildegard. This is from her work Scivias, which is translated The Way of Knowledge. The originals, unfortunately, were destroyed in World War II. And so all we have left is the pictures and the copies. Now we want to talk about the Gregorian chant. I mentioned chants a while ago. Another thing that the monks and the nuns would do, since they did have all of this time, was that they would sing. And these were spiritually oriented songs. They were songs in praise to God or praise to, or speaking of Christian work and things like that. And of course, they were in Latin because that's what they spoke. And so they sung in that as well. So these became part of the divine offices, this regular procedure of what they would do on a regular basis, day in and day out. So there was the Opus Dei, literally meaning in the Latin, the work of God. This was the common prayer that they would all pray together each day. And it was to emphasize the centrality of the liturgy, meaning their daily worship. And this wasn't just on Sunday or Wednesday night for them. This was going on with them 24 hours a day, or at least they considered it that way. And then another term in Latin, the Lectio Divina, that means the divine reading, the lifelong study of the scriptures. Now, as this music, this Gregorian chant developed, this became the basis of all modern Western music. Gregorian chant is named after Pope Gregory, one of the great popes of this particular time. So there was the Gregorian chant, there was the Ambrosian music, that was from the city of Milan. In Spain, they had the Mozarabic chant, and in France, of course, the Frankish chant. So this was empire wide, and chants had a very regular rhythm to them. And if you'll look in your Schoology topic, under the current topic that we're in, I've posted many examples of this, many of them from YouTube, which you can listen to and get a real feel for the flavor of it. Gregorian chant was a part of the Carolingian reform, a part of what Emperor Charlemagne was doing. But it's interesting that none of these chants were actually written down or codified, as we sometimes say, until the 11th and 12th century, so much later in history. You might ask, if they weren't written down, how did they know what to sing? Well, they memorized them, just like we still memorize many songs today. But because it was memorized, it would obviously greatly vary, because without a written form of it, how are you to know somebody didn't change it up or something like this? So we have to actually kind of guess how it must have sounded, because there's obviously no recordings of them. Characteristics of Gregorian chants: it's monophonic. By monophonic, mono meaning one, phonic meaning sound. There's just one basic melody line. It's melismatic, which means there was a lot of improvisation. Again, because it's not written down, you could improvise like modern day jazz and rock musicians do on this. It was plainly a cappella. That's a Latin word for as in the chapel, and a cappella means there was no instrumental accompaniment with it. One of the standard types of chants was based on the cantus plainus, which means the plain song or the plain chant, and this was due to the everyday character of the songs. By everyday character, we mean they would just borrow everyday folk song type of melodies that they would hear, and then use those and put their own words to them. That way you didn't have to create new songs constantly. When they begin to codify them or write them down, Their early form of what we would today call notes were called neumes. That was used to notate the music, and if you're wondering what that looked like in the early days, it looked just like this. So you can see on here, there's an early system of a staff. Today we would have 5 lines. They had 1, 2, 3, 4. And this would be similar to our modern day notation system. But since it wasn't exact, they just basically followed the flow and improvised their own melodies so that you didn't know exactly what this note is. You just guessed, and then you just knew, well, this has to be a little lower in pitch, and then it has to go up a little higher, then higher again, and then back down. And so it just sort of flowed as they improvised the notes there. That will conclude the portion about music, except that we do want to talk about how music actually affected the rise of what we would today call drama. This has actually happened twice in history, that drama has developed out of acting out religious themes. It happened once in ancient Greece. It happens again in history during the medieval times in the Catholic Church. So there was what was known as the liturgical trope. In the trope, they would add more words to the music. Again, they're improvising, and there were these elaborate verbal expressions of the text. They would add what they would call these long improvisational melismas to them, and this would actually aid in memorizing it, because they would, as they got the hang of doing this improvisation and it caught on, then if it was catchy enough, it would stick with them. The origin of drama in the West starts right here, and as I mentioned, it's interesting that this has happened twice in Western history. We do want to mention the cum hortus. This was a very, very early form of this troupe. It was added to the Easter hymn for the Mass being the Catholic's church service. It contains a short dialogue sung between two singers or choirs. And eventually, it was even performed in the public square outside of the church. So it wasn't just limited to the church. And that was probably one of the few exceptions to that. Then these dramas developed into plays, and one of the most well known was called Everyman. Now, Everyman is an expression today that we still use when we talk about old movies and books and TV shows where the main character is just kind of a regular guy or a regular lady. We call that everyman. They're just kind of representation of the average Joe out there. So this links liturgical and secular drama, because secular drama began to grow up also. They were very allegorical, which means they used a lot of symbols in there, and they were intended to teach a moral. Again, the way some movies and TV shows and books even do today. So this was a way to instruct the people in for moral conversion. Again, we have to remember most people can't read or write. So in seeing these things acted out, it's a way for everyone to be able to learn it. So there are obviously religious themes, the idea of life as a pilgrimage. You probably remember the song, "This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through." That's the idea of a pilgrimage. And then dealing with real sobering things like the inevitability of death, faith versus free will. So all of this, as we can see, has very much worship or liturgical overtones, things that go on in church. But as we mentioned, there's also drama that's secular that goes on outside of church, and this is called non-liturgical drama. This was pioneered by Roswitha, who was a German nun, but she also wrote poetry. She wrote in Latin, of course, like most of them did, but there were Roman stylistic influences because they had a chance to study classical history and classical literature like the Greeks and the Romans. And so, as mentioned, there's poetry, there's legends, there's plays, all of these things. One of them was called Theophilus. One was called The Conversion of the Harlot Thais. And so these are heavily moralistic. It's intended to educate you, but also convert you, bring you to a better life in God, repent from your evil ways, these kinds of things. And so these have these kinds of moralistic themes in them to lead you people to consider converting to the Catholic Church, converting to God. The Legend of Charlemagne also contains a classic piece of epic literature called the Song of Roland. See, the descendants after Charlemagne's time looked at his era as a golden age. As people would say today, those were the good old days. So it was kind of idealized. And so Charlemagne was actually canonized by the Catholic Church, which means he was made a saint in 1165. So there were these reliquaries and commemoratives that were commissioned and made for him. When we talk about these kinds of things, we're talking about objects of reverence. They usually are in a church, and that's why you have a pilgrimage to that church in order to see these things. So, in these kinds of epic poems, like the Song of Roland, we have things like Charlemagne's battle with the Basques, then songs like the Chanson de Geste and the Chansons de Histoire, oral tradition. The jongleurs are coming into play. Jongleurs, by the way, were these wandering minstrels. People would travel around and sing these songs extolling the virtues of Charlemagne, and so that people don't forget about how great he was, because they've written songs about him that people can sing over and over again. By the way, Roland was the favorite nephew of Charlemagne. He had many, and in these songs we see these retellings of their great deeds, the songs of history, and these minstrels would go around singing of all of these. The military and religious ideals were upheld in these songs as well. In the 11th century, marital values and chivalry, these codes were considered very, very important among people. So, again, they were meant to reinforce those morals and those ideals as well. We do see a very, very heavy anti-Muslim bias in these tales and songs. And again, you would expect that. Remember, it was Charlemagne's grandfather, Charles Martel, that defeated the Muslims and really kept maybe the entire world from going the way of the Muslim faith. So we would expect that, and that probably doesn't surprise us at all. And here we see one of these reliquaries that we just mentioned. It held the bones of the deceased. And so this was a way to pay homage to the dead here as well. This may come off as a little gross. This one actually held part of his skull. So people would come from and make pilgrimage to this to actually see a portion of the deceased body of Charlemagne. In the area of the visual arts, we have the illuminated books that we made mention of earlier. These Carolingian manuscripts were on parchment. There was no papyrus. Papermaking had not reached the West yet, so they had to have another way of doing this, and they used parchment. So that actually ended up being an advantage, because parchment turned out to be much more durable than papyrus. By the way, papyrus was what the original Bible was written on, and it's why we don't have any of those original copies today, or I shouldn't say copies, we don't have any of the original manuscripts today, because papyrus would crumble and fall apart pretty easily. The Gospel Book of Charlemagne was written in Roman, Byzantine, and Celtic styles, and the Utrecht Psalter, a psalter being something that contains all the Psalms of the Bible, was considered a masterpiece of the Carolingian Renaissance. And then there was the De Gulf Psalter as well. These had covers of carved ivory, so absolutely gorgeous, absolutely a work of art. And they were written in Carolingian minuscule. That was a type of writing that became the standard way of writing text, because it was very clean, very neat, very easy to read for those that could read. And it became a model in later years when the printing press was invented for how they would make their type, be able to print books. And we see this type of Carolingian minuscule that survives even hundreds of years later. An example here from the Gospel Book of Charlemagne. You see the classical style, you see the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but they're in togas, which they would not have worn. That was a part of the Roman Empire. But again, there's the classical Greco-Roman influence there. It was actually an early attempt at 3D, and this is way ahead of its time because these trees in the background are smaller because it gives it a sense of perspective. And this was way ahead of where artists were at this point in history. So this was considered very revolutionary. We mentioned those carved ivory book covers. Here's the crucifixion of Jesus. Note the use of continuous narration. In other words, the action is moving in time depending upon the panel that you look at. It's like our modern day comic strip. It's meant to tell a story. And again, here's the Greco-Roman influence because Jesus doesn't have a beard. And we know most Jews of that time would have had a beard. So we see a beardless Christ. Here we see the beginning of Psalm 1 from the De Golf Psalter. It begins a tradition of enlarging and illuminating the first letter of the first, 51st, and 101st Psalm. This carried over into the printing press in later years. Here we see the cover panels for the De Golf Psalter. It depicts scenes from both the Psalter and the papacy, or the Pope and his court. We see David and his court on the top left, and then David singing on his lyre here at the bottom left. And then Jerome, we mentioned St. Jerome earlier, who translated the Vulgate Bible, receiving a letter to correct the Psalter here in the top right, and then Jerome working on the corrections here on the bottom. And so the work of these monks was held in very high esteem by the people, and so they saw fit to make these elaborate covers out of them. Continuing on Charlemagne's palace at Aachen, the throne was on the second floor opposite the Savior Chapel. So he wanted his palace modeled on these temples in ancient Rome, or actually to the kingdom as well. And so in his palace there, large royal hall, lavishly decorated, joined to the chapel by a long gallery. So there was no separation of church and state at this period of history, obviously. The emperor could watch the church service and the Virgin Chapel with its relics right there from his throne room. So he didn't even have to move if he didn't want to. So his palace was said to be copied after the biblical description of Solomon's own throne. Charlemagne actually thought of himself in his chapel as a new Solomon, so to speak. And he used the church of San Vitale in Ravenna there as the model. There was the altar to the Savior to accommodate the liturgical services, and we mentioned the chapel to the Virgin there in which they had the reliquaries. Charlemagne's throne, again, this most wise Solomon. He thought himself to be the new Solomon. And so here we see a model of this reconstructed. Up here at the top, we have the 8-sided structure. If this rings a bell to you, we actually have a building on our campus that's octagonal, that has 8 sides. So you can actually just walk outside on our campus and see a structure similar to this, but this actually started back in the Middle Ages. So in this reconstructed model, only the chapel remains from the original structure, and that's why we're showing you this model here. So again, very elaborate, large hall connecting the palace to the chapel. So again, he could view all of this from his throne room. In the Carolingian monastery, the monastery was viewed as a miniature civic center. It was complex in terms of its function and design. It was considered the center of life for rural populations. They used what was called the St. Gall plan. So during this period of time between St. Benedict and Charlemagne, we had this decline of city life, and there was an emphasis on the more rural monasteries, the ones out in the country. But when the Carolingian period begins and progresses, this revitalized the cities and kept learning and the liturgy alive. So again, this is the birth of the modern day university. In the St. Gall plan, they used what was called a basilica style. Again, this was pioneered by the Greeks and especially the Romans. and it was designed to house as many as 120 monks and 170 serfs or servants. So this was considered a city unto itself. Very, very elaborate in terms of the plan. They use the Romanesque style, the basilica, as we stated a while ago. So these tend to be very large, Roman-looking architecture. We're dealing with a period of years here between 1000 and 1200 AD. And these were influenced by the travel and expansion of these different people who were engaging in trade. They would notice these ancient Roman structures, and this was obviously a big influence in them. Then people would come and look at them due to these pilgrimage. They were constructed of heavy stone arches, and this was very important because it was less subject to fire. Many structures made of wood would burn down, but these heavy stone arches obviously would not do that. They were larger, more spacious, as I mentioned, fireproof stone and masonry roofs. And in the church of Saint Cernin in Toulouse, they could hold many, many pilgrimages. All of these churches could. The community could go completely around the interior of the church, and so the church was right in the center of all of this. We mentioned the basilica. This is a style that's still used today. It's a classic nave, or what's called the Ship of Souls. This classic nave of souls is still popular even today. And as a matter of fact, right here, you can see in this structure, it's very similar. This is the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., that you still will see on TV today if there's the funeral for a president or an important type event in Washington that requires this type of structure. Now, in this Romanesque style, we have exterior decoration or sculpture. And since there's a lack of interior light, it's very important that you have big doors, portals, windows, all of these kinds of things. And even things like the jamb, the capital, the tramway being the central supporting post of the portal. Also, as a part of this Romanesque style, besides these items that we've already reviewed, we also have the tympanum, which also contain the mandorla and the archvolts. This is especially evident in the church of Saint Madeleine at Vézelay. And as we look at this, we see this incredible structure. We see the figure of Christ here in the middle. We see the zodiac around the edge here, and you may be thinking, well, why is there a zodiac on this illustration of these obvious biblical themes? Well, remember that during various parts of history, some of these things became intermingled, and it's what we call synchronism, where beliefs of other religions and even in what the Christians would have called pagan beliefs would get mixed in by other individuals. So whereas this might not have been permitted anywhere else, it somehow got into the artwork. But you can see the various things in this particular tympanum that we talked about earlier in the slide presentation. We'll see you next time for Chapter 10.